All right, so the one thing I didn't do for the last video was go over the extraocular muscles. So I just want to go over them real quickly. We have the first muscle, which is inferior, well, I guess we'll just do superior oblique. So superior oblique is this muscle here. So superior oblique. Right, so it helps deal with inward and downward movement of the eye. So inward, so like inward, think of behind there, like rotating it this way so you can see closer to your nose. So inward movement and downward movement. And then we have the inferior oblique, which is this muscle here. Inferior oblique deals with that inward movement as well, but it moves upward. So inward and upward. So inward, downward, superior oblique, inward, upward, inferior oblique. And then we have the medial rectus. It moves the muscle inward this way, so towards the medial side. So remember, inward is like turning inward, and then medial is moving medially. So it's kind of weird because the eye like turns. So you got to know what inward and then medially means, because medially is just towards the midline, and then inward is physically the eye turning in that direction. And then we have the lateral rectus, so the eye is moving laterally. Superior rectus up, inferior rectus down. But inferior rectus is turning towards the right, or superior rectus is turning towards the right, inferior rectus is turning towards the left. So the way I would memorize this is just superior oblique is downward and inward. Inferior oblique is upwards. Inferior oblique is upwards and inward, like turning inward. And then I would also remember that medial rectus just moves towards the medial aspect of the orbit. Lateral rectus moves towards the lateral aspect of the orbit. And then I would just remember superior rectus as moving up and inferior rectus as moving down. Just simplify it like that. Or you could use the H chart and understand how it's turning and moving. Either way works. Whatever simplifies it for you. Alright, I also wanted to do a review of the cranial nerves and the entrances and the exits of the cranial nerves to make it a little more simple for us. But let's do that. So I'm gonna start off with cranial nerve number one, so olfactory nerve. Go to the bone regions. Let's make sure those are solidified. Lacrimal and then ethmoid. So just a reminder that cranial nerve number one is going through the cribriform plate, entering the nasal cavity. That's what we're seeing here, the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. Cranial nerve 1 is going through there and entering the nasal cavity, right? You see the little branches of cranial nerve number 1, right? So cribriform plate entering the nasal cavity. That's cranial nerve number 1, olfactory. So the second cranial nerve, the optic nerve, it's going through the optic canal. So if I go here and solidify some of these bone structures, we can see the optic canal more clearly. Solidify. Okay, so just want us to be able to see the optic canal. Okay, so I'm gonna remove the brain just so we can see it more clearly. Right, you see optic canal, cranial nerve number 2, optic nerve. This is the optic canal. The optic nerve is going into and then entering the orbit via there, right? And then it's inserting on the optic disc of the eyeball. That's cranial nerve number 2, going through the optic canal to enter the orbit. Cranial nerve number 3, oculomotor, is entering the superior orbital fissure. So there we have cranial nerve number 3. That's better. Now let's just solidify all of the bone regions. All solid. There we go. Okay, that's perfect. Okay, let's remove that. So we see if I remove the temporal bone and then the right cerebrum. Okay, so we saw. Let me remove the parietal lobe as well. So we saw the optic nerve going through the optic canal. Now we're seeing the ocular motor nerve, right, move into the superior orbital fissure. Right, superior orbital fissure. Right, and then it's also entering the orbit. I'm not going to talk about the innervations and the functions. You guys can all look at the Quizlet for that. I just want to look at the 3D or spatial orientation of where these nerves are coming from and where they're going to. All right, so cranial nerve 3, ocular motor going through the superior orbital fissure. Now that we have that, let's move on to cranial nerve number 4. Matter of fact, let me just hollow this out just so we can see this a little bit more clearly. Hollow this out, ghost it, right? You see it going directly through that superior orbital fissure. Then I'm going to do the same thing for, let me just do it for optic nerve as well, just so we can be consistent. Solidify all of them. All right, let's ghost it. Right, you can see it going through the optic canal, right? Optic canal is over here. We see the optic nerve going through the optic canal. Now let's skip on to cranial nerve number 4, the trochlear nerve. Trochlear nerve. Let's solidify all. Let me add the rest of the bone regions because the trochlear nerve is going through the superior orbital fissure as well. Let's make sure that is clear. So you have the bone regions here. So I'm going to remove the temporal bone. I'm going to remove the right cerebral hemisphere. Right, we see cranial nerve number 4 going through the superior orbital fissure as well. So we saw number 3 going through there, number 4 going through here. And we're going to have some other cranial nerves going through this region as well. So let's ghost it, right? So if I'm looking through the superior orbital fissure, we see cranial nerve number 4, trochlear, going through that superior orbital fissure, entering the orbit as well. So 3 enters the orbit, ocular motor, trochlear, and optic all enter the orbit, but optic enters through the optic canal, and trochlear and ocular motor enter through the superior orbital fissure. So all of those are entering the orbit, and then cranial nerve 1, olfactory, is entering the nasal cavity via the cribriform plates. Now we're going to move on to the 5th cranial nerve, trigeminal. Right, trigeminal has 3 branches: ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular. They're all entering different regions. So let's move on to that so we can see that clearly. All right, so this one's a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to make sure I slow it down a little bit more so we can understand. Brain. Let's go to the bone. Okay, let's show the bone. Let me. Okay, let me try this one more time. wasting so much time. Let me just fix this because it's very sensitive. Okay. There we go. Okay. Let me remove this, remove this. I'm actually going to remove parts of the temporal lobe. Okay. Just remove the temporal. There we go. Okay, so now we can see clearly. Right, so cranial nerve number 5, we see trigeminal. Right? The ophthalmic branch of trigeminal enters the superior orbital fissure. Right, so we can see the ophthalmic branch of trigeminal entering via the superior orbital fissure. The maxillary branch, right? So wait, time out. So the ophthalmic branch enters the superior orbital fissure, enters the orbit. That's what we're seeing here, right? We could also see it exiting via the supraorbital notch slash foramen. And then we have the maxillary branch going through foramen rotundum, right? Foramen rotundum. Right, it goes through foramen rotundum. And you can see it going from foramen rotundum all the way to the infraorbital foramen. So ophthalmic is here, maxillary is here. It enters foramen rotundum and it exits the infraorbital foramen, right? And then we have the last branch of trigeminal, which is the mandibular. So mandibular goes through foramen ovale, foramen ovale, all the way from foramen ovale to the mandible. And these are all parts of the mandibular branch. Right, these are all parts of the mandibular branch. You can see it going through foramen ovale and then to the mandible. All right, so we have mandibular going through foramen ovale, right, going to the mandible. We see the maxillary branch going through foramen rotundum and exiting out of the infraorbital foramen. Right, so that's just the major portion that we need to worry about. So just remember, maxillary goes through foramen rotundum and enters out the infraorbital foramen. And then we have ophthalmic enters the superior orbital fissure and enters the orbit. That's cranial nerve number 5. Now we're going to look at cranial nerve number 6, abducens. So cranial nerve number 6, abducens. Abducens is entering the orbit via the superior orbital fissure. Also, let me get the rest of the bone regions. So we just saw the superior orbital fissure multiple times, so I don't have to solidify it this time, but I'll ghost this portion, right? We see abducens going through the superior orbital fissure. So abducens goes through there, trochlear goes through there, ocular motor goes through there. The first branch of V1 of cranial nerve number 5, ophthalmic, goes through there. So a lot of the cranial nerves going through the superior orbital fissure. That's cranial nerve number 6. We have 6 more. So cranial nerve number 6. And then let's look at cranial nerve number 7. Right, so that's going, cranial nerve number 6 is going to the orbit. Cranial nerve number 7 is slightly more complicated. So let me get all of the bones back. All solid, okay. So I'm gonna need the temporal bone for this. Okay. I'm gonna remove the cerebellum. And then we're going to go from there. Okay, so we see cranial nerve number 7 is here, facial nerve. So facial nerve goes through the internal acoustic, meatus, foramen, internal auditory, foramen. Remember those 4 word combinations you could use. So it's going through this structure. All right, so cranial nerve number 7. And we might as well just ghost this portion. Okay. So cranial nerve number 7 is right there. And if we follow it, it's coming out of the styloid mastoid foramen. Styloid mastoid foramen. Cranial nerve number 7 is coming out of the styloid mastoid foramen. Right? And then you can see it going all the way to the face, all the way to different regions of the face. Right, so it's going it's going into the internal auditory foramen, meatus, internal acoustic, meatus or foramen, and then it's coming out of the styloid mastoid foramen, and then it's going to these different regions of the face. Now we're going to look at cranial nerve number 8, vestibulocochlear. Cranial nerve number 8. It's a lot easier to follow cranial nerve number 8 because it's doing the same thing as cranial nerve number 7, but it's stopping inside of the internal acoustic foramen or meatus because it has to innervate the muscles, not the muscles, sorry, it has to innervate the structures for hearing. So not muscles, structures for hearing. And I'm pretty sure you guys will learn about that next week as well. So let's move on to, okay, there we go. So we saw cranial nerve number 7 going through the internal acoustic foramen or meatus, and now we're going to see cranial nerve number 8 do the exact same thing, but stop here because it has to innervate structures of hearing. Right, and that being the vestibule and the cochlea. There we go. We see it going through the internal acoustic meatus slash foramen, internal auditory meatus slash foramen. And we see it stopping inside of there. So that's cranial nerve number 7. Sorry, cranial nerve number 8. We did cranial nerve number 7 and 8 going through the same structure. Now we're going to look at cranial nerve number 9. So glossopharyngeal. So glossopharyngeal. So glossopharyngeal You can see glossopharyngeal here. So let me solidify all of these structures. Okay. Okay, so now we're looking at cranial nerve number 9, glossopharyngeal. Let me get. Let me get the occipital bone. There we go. Okay. Right. So cranial nerve number 9 right here, glossopharyngeal. Right. It's going through the jugular foramen. And you can see it going all the way down here. Right, so from the brainstem to through the jugular foramen and then going down here. Now we're going to look at cranial nerve number 10, vagus nerve, so the wandering nerve. Cranial nerve number 10 is going through the jugular foramen as well. Cranial nerve number 10, vagus nerve, and you can see it traveling all the way down. All the way down to innervate some autonomic structures. To deal with some autonomic innervation. Now we're going to look at cranial nerve number 11, the accessory nerve. The cranial nerve number 11 is going through the jugular foramen as well. Right, so this is the jugular foramen, this is the jugular foramen. Right, cranial nerve number 11 is going from the brainstem to the jugular foramen and then traveling down the spinal cord. Traveling down the cervical spinal level. And then we're going to look at the last cranial nerve, which is the hypoglossal nerve. The hypoglossal. And this cranial nerve is going through the hypoglossal canal. So let me just show you that. It's on the occipital bone. All right, so you see cranial nerve 12 coming from the brainstem and going through the hypoglossal canal. Right? Hypoglossal canal, hypoglossal nerve. All right, and that's all I really wanted to show you. I just wanted to show you where all these cranial nerves were coming from and traveling to, so you can kind of understand their functions when you're studying them. All right, so guys, have a good rest of your week, and I hope this helped.